All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this NOFO presentation about the Workforce Grants 101. We're talking about budgets this afternoon, and so we will be discussing that with our presenter. Before I hand it off to our presenter for today, just a couple of housekeeping things. My name is Kirsten Bayer with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support, and I will be your moderator and technical support for this session. If you have any questions as the session proceeds, please feel free to reach out to me via the chat and I will help you to the best of my ability. This session is being recorded and it will be accessible on the NOFO website for the apprenticeship NOFO, and I will put that website in the chat momentarily. You can access today's recording, you can access the earlier session's recording, as well as both of the slide decks. We also have, hold on one second. All right, we also have closed captioning at the bottom of the session for accessibility, and the recordings will be fully transcribed as well. The same session about the NOFO introduction session that was earlier this afternoon, as well as this budget session today, will be repeated live tomorrow. And then another information session will be on July 21st. And you can access those registrations on the NOFO website. But if you aren't able to stay for the full session today, or if you want to rewatch the session for information of any kind, or maybe you missed the earlier session this afternoon, feel free to register for the one tomorrow or on the 21st. Or you can also always rewatch the recordings as well. And with that, I think, one more thing that I want to mention is that if you have any questions or comments or concerns throughout the session, please feel free to post those in the chat and then we will address them at the end of the session. If there's anything during the session that you ask that we cannot address from our team, then we will put that on the FAQ and you can read the answers on the FAQ on the NOFO website. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to our presenter today, Tamika. Go ahead and take it away and introduce yourself.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Tamika Chisholm. I am the Fiscal and Programmatic Monitoring Manager for the Workforce Development Grants. I am completing this presentation in the absence of John Barr. John is out for the week. So any questions that I am unable to answer today, we'll put it in the FAQ list, or John and I will be able to respond when he returns. For this budget webinar, we're going to go over Workforce Grants 101, an overview of the grant submission requirements under the Illinois Grant Accountability and Transparency Act, otherwise known as GATA. We can go to the next slide. So there are three parts to the grant life cycle: the pre-award, award, and post-award process and requirements. So this presentation will focus on these three requirements. Next slide. So GATA, or the Grant Accountability and Transparency Act, is a state law. The state of Illinois placed this into law to increase accountability and transparency with the use of grant funds. Also to reduce the administrative burden, both on state agencies and grantees. And with those burdens, some of the uniformity that the state has provided is having uniform reporting requirements, having uniform auditing requirements, reducing the number of on-site state reviews, and also reducing the number of requested information and documentation. And also GATA has adopted the federal grant guidance and regulations codified at 2 CFR Part 200, the uniform requirements, or you may have heard it as the uniform guidance as well. Next slide, please. So there are some pre-award requirements that grantees must complete prior to a grant award being executed. Those requirements are the grantee going through a registration process, a grantee pre-qualification, also the financial and administrative risk assessment, also known as the internal control questionnaire or ICQ. The grantee will also go through a risk assessment and mandatory disclosures and conflict of interest documents, which is all a part of the GATA portal. Next slide, please. So the GATA and the indirect cost rate system, grantees should visit the grants.gov, the grants.illinois.gov website, which is the Office of Management and Budget GATA website. Within that website, you will see the tab for the entry point for the GATA portal, which you will go through registration, pre-qualification, the fiscal administrative risk assessment, and it will also direct you to the centralized indirect cost rate system, which in each grantee will need to elect the indirect cost rate option that is necessary to obtain a state grant award. Next slide, please. Visiting the grants.illinois.gov portal website, grantees can go through the registration process. You will need to utilize a personal or business email address to establish an account. Once your account is established, you can complete your registration at the GATA portal by associating your illinois.gov account with your organization. And this will allow you access to those trigger points that we discussed earlier and go through the grantee pre-qualification verifications. Next slide, please. So the grantee pre-qualifications, the grantee must have a valid DUNS number. The grantee must be current with their SAMS.gov accounts. The grantee must be in good standing with the Secretary of State. The grantee should not be on the federal excluded parties list, should not be on the Illinois Stop Payment list, and should not be on the Department of Health and Family Services provider sanction list. So the grantee must be in good standing with all the items listed on this slide during the pre-qualification process to move on to the remainder parts of the process. Thank you. Next slide. Once the grantee goes through the pre-qualification process, the GATA portal does send out an email to communicate the qualified status. If there are any issues with those pre-qualification processes, the GATA will also provide an email noting the issues. For instance, if the DUNS number is not current, if the SAM cage code is not current or expired, if the entity is not in good standing with the Secretary of State and need to update their information, and for some reason, if the entity falls on the federal excluded parties list, you will receive a notification from the GATA portal if any of these issues should occur. Next slide, please. So for the GATA framework for the risk assessment, within the GATA portal, the risk assessment or ICQ was automated. The grantee must go into the portal to complete this. The questionnaire is completed on an annual basis by the grantee. The ICQ should also be completed at an entity-wide level, meaning that the questions adhere to the organization as a whole and not specifically to the grant that you are applying to. All state agencies will utilize the results of the ICQ. So you only need to fill out the ICQ once annually, and that questionnaire will be available to any state agencies if you apply for different grants throughout different state agencies. The programmatic risk assessment will be conducted by the awarding agency, such as GCEO, during the application process. This is unique to each NOFO, and the grant program is typically completed if the proposal is recommended for funding. Once the programmatic risk assessment is completed by the awarding agency, the grantee will be notified. Any risk profiles will be determined based on the risk assessments. And again, any conditions or additional monitoring that may be posed due to some risk assessments that come from the programmatic risk assessment will be communicated to the grantee. Next slide, please. Also, in order for a grantee to obtain a state award, they must elect an end-of-cost rate selection. And this is selected through the centralized indirect cost system. An indirect cost rate is a device that is used for determining the appropriate amount of indirect costs for each program. The indirect cost rate is the ratio between the total indirect expenses and some indirect cost base. Grantees have different options when selecting their indirect cost rate. The grantee may use their current federal negotiated indirect cost rate agreements. The grantee may negotiate a rate with the state of Illinois. If the grantee does not have a current federal negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, or does not have negotiated rate with the state of Illinois, or does not plan on negotiating a rate with the state of Illinois, they may elect to use the federal 10% de minimis, or the entity may decline to have any indirect cost rate, which means the grantee will not receive reimbursement for any indirect cost expenditures. Next slide, please. Grantees may access the centralized indirect cost system through the grants.gov, the grants.illinois.gov menu in the drop down from the Grantee Links tab. This site also includes frequently asked questions. There are training modules. There are forms and indirect cost rate templates. And there are also Department of Labor indirect cost guides to assist the grantees in selecting the indirect cost rate selection that would be appropriate for their organization. An indirect cost proposal or the rate election must be initiated with the centralized indirect cost rate system upon the notice of award. The indirect cost rate proposal or rate election must be completed no later than 3 months after the effective date of the state award. Uniform guidance does require an annual submission of the indirect cost proposal or rate election. The centralized indirect cost rate system will be used for annual renewals. Those annual submissions must be received within 6 months after the grantee's fiscal year end. Next slide, please. So who is required to utilize the central indirect cost rate system? Again, any organization that receives a grant from the state of Illinois must use the centralized indirect cost rate system to elect their indirect cost rate. Again, if the grantee has a federal negotiated rate, they're required to provide that information through the indirect cost rate system. If the grantee chooses to use the 10% de minimis rate, they have to utilize the indirect cost rate system to make that election as well. Grantees do have the option to accept a lower indirect cost rate, but state agencies are not allowed to force coerce a grantee into taking a lower rate. But grantees must make an election and utilize the centralized indirect cost rate system in order to receive a grant from the state of Illinois. Next slide, please. So next we'll talk about the standard application and grant award documents. Grantees may see a list of notice of funding opportunities by going to the Catalog of State Financial Assistance website. Each NOFO submission will require a uniform application for state grant assistance. The grantee will also need to submit a uniform budget template and a notice of state award application. Next slide, please. So typical application requirements are an executive summary, which is a key element to a grant proposal. This allows the grantee to capture the grant and provide an abstract of the grant proposal. Technical and programmatic proposal, applicant capacity, documentation of need, operational plan, projected outcomes, and return on investments, which we'll explain further in detail as we proceed through the slides. Implementation plan, and a schedule that outlines how the plan would be executed. The required technical and programmatic forms and the exhibits that are required of the application. Resumes of key program staff that would be a part of the grants. Memorandum of understandings or other partnership agreements if there are other partners or subrecipients that will be a part of this grant. And also a budget proposal with itemized grant line items and expenditures that will be associated with the grants. Next slide, please. So let's talk about applicant capacity. Applicant capacity should explain who you are. What is your relationship to the targeted population? What are your qualifications? What other projects have you accomplished that may mirror the grant proposal that you're submitting? Who are your partners? Are there other partners that will be a part of the grant that would help you accomplish the grant's project goals? What are their qualifications? Describe the organization as a whole. Do you have any similar projects that you're currently undertaking that are similar to the grant that you are proposing with your application? Describe the qualification of the individuals responsible to carry out the project activities. That can go along with their resume. Some historical information regarding their background and how they have been a part of projects similar to the grant proposal that you're submitting. Also be sure to list any facilities, equipment, or resources that would be available to the project and the sources. Next slide, please. So documentation of needs. Who is the targeted population? What are their needs? What are the problems of that targeted population? What are some of the causes of those identified needs or problems? Supporting documentation to support the existence of the identified needs and problems. And to support grantees with being able to explain and demonstrate those needs, you can find some information at census.gov, BLS.gov, which is a Bureau of Labor Statistics, and also the Illinois Report Card, which can give you information on schools that are within the area that you are planning to address. And then also identify the need and problem in great detail and also describe the population affected by the need and problem in great detail. Next slide, please. So next we'll talk about the operational plan. What's your solution to the need and problem? The grantee should explain how they will approach that solution, how they plan to take action to address that identified need or problem. What are the identified steps that will be taken? Who will do that? How long do you think that it would take to achieve the project goals? That can be outlined in your work plan. Explain the project goals in great detail. And again, how will you meet the need or solve those identified project goals? Be specific, list measurable objectives. State the projected outcomes and how that would benefit your targeted population. Think about state planned activities, methodologies, the timetable for accomplishing those planned activities, and explain how the project will be managed and the staff or employees that will be involved in managing those plans. And then always remember to tie those objectives back to the identified need and problem. Next slide, please. So again, return on investment. Your projected outcome should be measurable. You should be able to show your proposed project and how it supports those that it's going to affect. Show that you have considered the need and problem from many different angles. Consider all available resources that will be needed to carry out the project. How will the project be evaluated? How will you show your measurable accomplishment of the stated goals and objectives? And very importantly, sustainability. How will this project be continued after the grant expired? So these are definitely things that the grantee should think about when making their grant proposal, and also think about the longevity of the grant project. Next slide, please. Another application, a part of submitting a grant proposal for the state, is a uniform application for the state grant assistance. And on the application, the grantee would need to provide agency information, the funding opportunity information. You will see instructions on how to submit an application and the required grant information. We would need the applicant completed section. There would be contact information that should be filled out. Key project information include location, term, and amount requested, fiscal information, and certification. Next slide, please. The uniform budget template that will go along with the grant state application. The uniform budget templates for most state grants are modified by the federal budget template. Basic budget line item definitions on the uniform administrative guidelines are within the budget template to help support the grantee navigate throughout the budget template. General requirements when thinking about your budget and your expenditures is that the cost should be allowable, reasonable, and allocable. Next slide, please. When thinking about allowable costs, you can visit Uniform Guidance 2 CFR 200.403. So this lists some of the factors affecting the allowability of the costs. The cost should be necessary and reasonable for the grantee to perform the federal award or the state grant. Conform to any limitation or exclusions set forth in principles or in the federal award as to the types or amounts of the cost. The cost should be consistent with policies and procedures that apply to the federal, the non-federal entity, and other federal financed activities. Be consistent with the treatment of your expenditures. The cost may not be assigned to a federal award as a direct cost if any other cost incurred in the same purposes in that circumstance has been allocated to a federal award as an indirect cost. So if you have expenditures that are usually categorized as indirect costs, the grantee must use that same methodology when using state and federal funds as well. All processes and procedures associated with expenditures for the grant should be determined and in accordance with the generally accepted accounting principles or GAAP. Costs should not be included as costs or used to meet cost sharing or matching requirements of any other federally financed program in either the current or prior periods. And all documentation of expenditures and costs must be adequately documented. Next slide, please. Again, costs must be reasonable. A cost is reasonable in its nature and the amounts. The cost does not exclude which would be incurred by a prudent person under the circumstances prevailing at the time the decision was made to incur the costs. So when thinking about your expenditures for your state grant or federally funded grants, the cost should remain reasonable if it's used with non-federal or state grants. Whether the cost is a type generally recognized as ordinary and necessary for the operation of the non-federal entity or the proper or efficient performance of the federal award. Cost restraints or requirements imposed by such factors such as sound business practices, arm's length bargaining. With federal and state grants, we must ensure that we're utilizing our procedures and policies within our organizations. And also with arm's length bargaining, ensure that the relationships with our vendors that we are using, look at relationships, look at conflicts of interest when contracts or cost negotiations are being thought of. Next slide, please. Oh. Allowable costs. When utilizing expenditures on a federal estate grants, all costs must be able to be allocated to a program, one of your budgeted line items, or categorized as indirect cost. The benefits, both the federal award and other works of the non-federal entity, can be distributed in proportions and may be approximated using reasonable methods. So when there are shared expenditures, the non-federal entity must ensure that each funding stream is allocated its appropriate cost, and a methodology is utilized by the non-federal entity and can be demonstrated. Next slide, please. So there are two types of costs typically associated with a grant program. So you have your program costs and your administrative costs. We also have a SMARTS module that grantees can go to utilize for additional support in identifying direct and indirect costs. Next slide, please. So types of costs. So direct costs can be identified specifically with a particular final cost objective to the federal award or other internally or externally funded activities that can be directly assigned to such activities. So your direct costs should be able to be allocated to your direct expenditure line items. And your indirect costs, or F&A, are costs that can be commonly jointed for the purpose of benefiting more than one cost objective and not readily assigned to the cost objectives specified through your direct cost expenditure line items. And again, going to the Uniform Guidance 200.413 and 200.456 would allow additional examples on how to identify direct and indirect costs for your grant program. Next slide, please. Within the Uniform Budget Template outline, there are various sections throughout the template. The first section identifies the instructions on how to navigate through the budget template and how to fill out each section. Section A of the grant funds includes a summary, which the summary includes a total for each budgeted line item. And it also includes your indirect cost rate information. Section B, or the match section, that is where the grantee can identify any non-state funds that would be used for the grant proposal. The certification process is for the CFO, executive director, or equivalent positions within the grantee that will sign and approve the budget template. The FATA data collection, if the grant proposal includes any subrecipients that will receive $30,000 or more funding from the grant, that section must be completed by the grantee, which would include subrecipient information such as their DUNS number, and also based on some fiscal questions, you may have to list your subrecipients' top 5 executives and compensation. And then section C goes over the budget worksheet and narrative that would be filled out for each budgeted line item that the grantee would use for the budget template. Next slide, please. So section A includes the state of Illinois funds. Again, this includes all the funds that the grantee will request for the grant. This includes all the budgeted expenditures. Any line items on the budget templates, those budget line items are not applicable to the specific grant for the proposal. And then also all revenue that is requested must equate to the budgeted expenditures. Next slide, please. Again, as mentioned earlier, the indirect cost selection will also be noted on the budget template as well. The entity must make a selection if using the federally approved indirect cost rate, the negotiated rate with the state of Illinois, the 10% de minimis, if the grantee is using a restricted rate designated by a programmatic or statute policy, or again, if the grantee chooses not to request a reimbursement of indirect cost. Within section A for the indirect cost selection, when making that selection, also the percent of the indirect cost would have to be inserted into the uniform template at that time as well. Next slide, please. Section B, again, this section is for any non-state of Illinois funds that will be used to support the grant. The funds must be verifiable from the non-entity records. This can include contributions, in-kind contributions, any additional non-state or federal funding. Again, these must be necessary and reasonable to accomplish the project or program objective. They must be allowable under subpart E. These matching funds must not be paid by federal governments or under another federal award, except where federal statute or authorizing program specifically provides that the federal funds made can be available for the program. And the funds must be approved within the budget when requiring by the federal awarding agency. So again, this one is for any non-state of Illinois matching funds that you would use to help support the grants. If there's additional funds, they may be associated with your grant proposal and with your budget. You would fill that out at this section. Next slide, please. So once the grantee has gone through the application process and the application has been approved and awarded, the grantee will receive what's called the Uniform Grant Agreement. And within that grant agreement, part 1 lists all the articles which outlines all the specific requirements and agreements that the non-federal entity must adhere to and the requirements for the state of Illinois. So some of those articles specifies, again, the award and grantee specific information. So this will outline the award, how much the grantee was awarded, and the restrictions and requirements for the award, definitions on payment, the scope of the grant activities, outlines the budget, required certification, criminal disclosures. So if you've received a grant from the state of Illinois before, you have seen the Uniform Grant Agreement and all the articles associated with it. Next slide, please. Again, part 2 lists additional requirements that are specified within the grant agreements, the maintenance and accessibility of records, audit requirements, termination, notice of changes, conflict of interest, equipment or property requirements. Every single article should be reviewed by the grantee before signing and submitting back to the state agency. So please be sure when your organization receives the Uniform Grant Agreement that these sections are reviewed thoroughly. Next slide, please. After the articles of requirements, there are exhibits. The exhibits give you a summary of the project description. It outlines all deliverables and milestones to be completed by the grantee. It talks about the payment schedule, lists important contact information. The performance measures are outlined and reporting requirements associated, performance standards and specific conditions. So the exhibits are very specific to the grant awards. It outlines any reporting requirements that are associated with the deliverables, any requirements or reporting requirements that are associated with performance measures and standards. So those exhibits are another important piece of the grant agreement, and allows the grantee to understand and know all requirements that are conditioned under this agreement as well. Next slide, please. So the next part are the grantor and the project specific terms. For the grantor specific terms, those are sections that may require additional requirements for the program, such as if the grantee has changes in key personnel. It talks about the recovery of funds. So these are additional requirements that are listed. It talks about requirements and conditions if the grantee wants to receive gifts, and it talks about the request for additional information. So those are just some of the specifics that you will see in that part 2. But part 3, the project specific terms, if applicable to the grant, this may include a program manual or additional program attachments associated with the award. Next slide, please. So these are additional resources for grantees when going through the grant process. Definitely grants.illinois.gov will allow you to gain more understanding if you are not already have an illinois.gov account. And if you don't already have a GATA portal, this will allow you to go through that process and gain a better understanding. IllinoisWork.net would definitely allow entities to have a better understanding of workforce, and also the WIOA state plan. Uniform guidance, if the grantee is not familiar with uniform guidance, there's links that will allow you to gain more understanding to ensure that your entity is following those requirements and have process and procedures in place according to those requirements as well. And also visit the workforce GPS. Again, that's another good tool with understanding the workforce development entity and programs as well. Next slide, please. So again, this presentation we are conducting on behalf of John Barr. For additional information, you may contact John. Right now, he is out of the office, so the emails will go to myself, Tamika Chisholm, and I would be able to assist in answering questions as well. I will check the chat box. I don't think that we have any questions right now, but if you think of any additional questions over the next couple weeks, please let us know, and we will definitely do our best in getting back to you and getting those questions answered. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Tamika. And again, I don't see any questions or anything, but just to reiterate, this session was recorded and the PowerPoint slides and recording from today will be up on the WorkVets website. We also have repeated sessions. This session will be repeated tomorrow, as well as the information session from earlier this afternoon will be repeated tomorrow as well. So feel free to register for those and join us tomorrow, and you can access those registrations on the NOFO website. And with that, I'll close this out. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your Tuesday.